How did Hitler rise to power? Or in other words, how did Germany, a democratic republic, turn totalitarian in the span of months?
Okay, let's go through an overview of Hitler's rise to power. Throughout the 1920s, the Nazi Party, which Hitler was gaining command of, was gaining a lot of prominence. Through peace and violence, they had their own paramilitary that intimidated their political opponents. And then, as Hitler was gaining more seats in the Reichstag, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor, which is it's like an important role in the executive branch in Germany. So Hitler was able to mount a lot of political pressure on President Hindenburg to appoint him Chancellor. Then, a communist terror attack occurred, and Hitler used this to get emergency powers, because a lot of people were scared of communism. And then, using his emergency powers, he abolishes other parties and takes away basic freedom. He purged the Nazi Party in case anyone there would do something against him, pretty similar to what Stalin did. And then Hindenburg dies, and very few people stand in Hitler's way.
Let's ask the question of the century. Who exactly was Adolf Hitler? He was born to a quiet and abusive family. You should for more details on that, please watch the oversimplified video. And all I will say on that, and on the other issue regarding his childhood, is that he was mothered by his father's cousin. That's all I will say. Then, as many of you know the famous story, he failed to become an artist. He wasn't really able to get a job, so he was homeless for much of his 20s. He lived on the streets of Vienna. And then, he went on to fight in World War I. And the guy was so passionate in his German nationalism that even though he was living in Austria and he was supposed to enlist in the Austrian military, he moved to Germany so that he could enlist in Germany. He was that passionate. And then he was gaining some prominence within the Nazi Party. And just 4 years into his time in the Nazi Party, that was in 1923, he was just 34, he started a nationalist insurrection against the German government. And as many of you will know, the Putsch failed. Okay, let's talk about a significant factor in Hitler's rise to power in the 1920s. His paramilitary, the SA, which is also known as brown shirts. They were known for battling communists in the streets, and one of the ways they probably got their weapons was the fact that many of them were former soldiers in World War I, so they had the right connection. Notably, Ernest Röhm, and as you will come to see, Ernest Röhm was a very significant figure in the SA. See, in 1923, the SA had only 2,000, but in 1933, because of Ernest Röhm, they had 2 million. Ernest Röhm was able to recruit all those people. And the SS, they started out as Hitler's personal bodyguard. And they had 900 men in 1929, and then they had 35,000. So his paramilitary was growing throughout the years. Now let's talk about Hitler's electoral success. So in the late 1920s, the German economy began to collapse. And it's really all the Nazi movement, because they were scapegoating all those people. So in 1928, the Nazis only had 3% of the vote, but in 1930, they had 18% of the vote. So it went up by 16%, presumably because of the economic collapse. And a similar thing can be said about the communists, except it didn't go up by as much. And the Social Democrats, who were more moderate, well, their share of the vote went down. And then later in the 1930s, the Nazis even gathered more votes. The National Socialists got 37% of the vote in 1932. And then another election in 1932 slightly went down. But in March of 1943, they were by far the largest party, 43.9. The second largest party only had 18%. It shows you how much popularity Hitler was gaining. Let's talk about one of the most pivotal things in Hitler's rise to power, the chancellorship. Before we talk about that, we have to talk about what is a chancellor in the context of Weimar Germany. So a chancellor would essentially lead the Reichstag, right? And I talked to this sort of German historian. He knows what he's talking about, right? And he compared the position of a chancellor in Weimar Germany, the position of the Speaker of the House in America, meaning that the chancellor put things up for a vote. But the chancellor, however, was not democratically elected. The chancellor would be appointed by the president, who in this case was Paul von Hindenburg. The president was democratically elected, and the president would appoint the chancellor. So it was sort of indirect when it came to the people's will. Let's talk about one of those chancellors, Heinrich von Bruning. So Hindenburg appointed this very conservative guy, Heinrich von Bruning, as chancellor. Bruning did not like the Nazis or the communists, so he banned their militias using his emergency presidential decree. However, he failed to contain them, and we'll look into that in just a minute. Before, let's talk about Bruning's beliefs. He wasn't a big fan of democracy like many other conservatives of the time, so he banned all those newspapers that he deemed threatening to his party's power. And he feared that because Hindenburg was so old, Hindenburg was actually pretty old. Hindenburg was born in 1847, and this was 1931. So we're talking about an 84-year-old president in a time where the life expectancy was like, I don't know, 70 years, 65 at best. So he feared that because Hindenburg's death was imminent, Hitler would pretty much be the next president. This was democratically happen. So he may have thought that the only way to stop Hitler was through some form of authoritarianism. Now let's talk about Bruning's blunder. So I've attached a video of Tick explaining the economics of this, but I will not be explaining the economics of this because I am not a credible source on economics. But let's take a look. So Bruning wanted to get rid of war debt through some complex economic mechanism by reducing wages. However, if you're reducing workers' wages during a depression, you're going to be pretty unpopular. So Hitler utilized that to undermine Bruning's power. And then Bruning lost his chancellorship. What had happened was that Hindenburg ran against Hitler in a presidential election. Hindenburg wanted to be elected to a second term, right? But Hitler was barely defeated by Hindenburg, right? So Hindenburg thought that this had happened because of how unpopular Bruning was. They no longer trusted Bruning. So he appointed another guy, Franz von Papen, right? Franz von Papen was more friendly to the Nazis as he took away Bruning's ban on their newspapers, and he supported an authoritarian government, which was a conflict with a prominent general, Kurt von Schleicher. Kurt von Schleicher supported this broad coalition of both people on the left and people on the right, so that, because he wanted the government to be more in alignment with the people's will. He also had some sympathy towards trade unions. And then Kurt von Schleicher used his position as a general in the military to put a lot of pressure on Papen. Then Papen resigned, and Kurt von Schleicher was appointed the chancellor. And then Hitler wanted to be chancellor, so the Germans tried to negotiate with him. What had happened was that the conservative German politicians were really jealous of it. They saw that he could generate a ton of support. He could put nationalistic sentiments in the German people, and he could use economic populism on them, but the conservative politicians could not. So they offered him a cabinet position. However, Hitler only wanted to be in the cabinet if he were made chancellor. President Hindenburg, however, did not do that. So, how was Hitler made chancellor? As already said, Kurt von Schleicher wanted this diverse government coalition with both conservatives and left-wingers. He supported trade unions, right? But Hindenburg did not like that. He was especially frightened by the trade unions as a conservative. So Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor because he preferred that over Kurt von Schleicher. Now, let's take a look at some factors that put pressure on Hindenburg to make Hitler chancellor. A quick summary. So, Hitler had his aggressive, violent paramilitary. The conservative politicians did not want to deal with the chaos of the SA and the SS fighting communists in the streets. They did not want to have to put up with them. And then Hitler had something they did not have. He could generate a lot of nationalism and economic populism, which the conservatives could not. And they kind of wanted that. They saw that of use to them. And finally, they preferred having Hitler as chancellor instead of Kurt von Schleicher, because Hindenburg worried that Kurt von Schleicher would empower trade unions, aka labor unions, and also he did not want that coalition of the far left and the far right. Okay, let's look at one other factor that played into Hitler's rise to power: fear of communism. At the time, many groups feared communism. For example, the church and even the religious people, they were threatened by the atheistic tendencies among communists. Many communists were fairly secular and atheistic, right? Karl Marx, as a matter of fact, is known for his advocacy of atheism. And the middle class and the wealthy, well, their fears were more economic rather than religious. See, if someone wants to take over my business and nationalize it, I'm not going to like that person. I'm going to be scared. And even different countries feared communism. Several times in the beginning of the 1920s, there were several communist rebellions across Europe. And A coalition of countries, Britain, Czechoslovakia, America, France, came to try to stop those communists. US troops were fighting in Siberia to try to stop the spread of communism. People were actually scared of this ideology. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag burned. A mentally ill, unemployed communist construction worker was immediately accused of burning it. Here's a quote from Smithsonian. Point is, he was accused of burning it. And I'm not going to make any more claims on who exactly did that because many historians debate this. As a matter of fact, many think it was actually Hitler that burned the Reichstag in order to do this as a way to gain power for himself. But I'm not going to make such claims. Point is, Hitler used this. And how did he use it exactly? The Reichstag Fire decree. Hitler convinced Hindenburg, who was already a pretty conservative and anti-communist, of the imminent communist threat. Hindenburg decreed that, thus, restrictions on personal liberty, on the right of free expression of opinion, including freedom of the press, are permissible beyond the legal limits otherwise prescribed. So he's allowing such restrictions. What did they do with those restrictions? Well, thousands of communists and social democrats, these were the left-wingers, they opposed Hitler and Hindenburg, they were arrested. Many of them were members of the Reichstag. And what repercussion does that have? Well, if you have less opponents in the Reichstag, that means you can pass more laws that benefit you. Using his momentum after the Reichstag Fire decree, Hitler consolidated his power even more in what became called the Enabling Act of 1933. This law allowed Hitler to make laws without the approval of President Hindenburg nor the German parliament, the Reichstag, and he could even pass laws that violate the Constitution. So Hitler is pretty much an absolute dictator. And how did Hitler pass this law? Well, as many of you recall, due to the Reichstag Fire decree, many communist and social democrat members of the Reichstag were arrested. So because they weren't there and the fact that they formed most of the resistance to Hitler, Hitler was able to do so many things because much of the resistance was gone. And then Hitler went on from cracking down on opposition within the government to suppressing any opposition within the citizenry. By August 1933, all parties but the Nazi Party was banned. Communists, Zentrum, all other parties but the Nazis. Interestingly enough, some of those parties that were banned had actually helped Hitler enable the Enabling Act. And then socialists and communists were arrested, labor unions were outlawed, socialist newspapers were banned. Pretty predictable of Hitler to do. And then Hitler carried out the famous Night of the Long Knives. Between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, Hitler executed top Nazi officials who he feared would overthrow him. Ernst Röhm being one of them, the leader of the SA. Even though Ernst Röhm had actually really helped Hitler rise to power, he definitely threatened Hitler's actual power. So the SS attacked Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA. To an extent, this could be called an SS versus SA, but that's to an extent statement. So Ernst Röhm gets executed by the SS, and a lot of other people get executed, notably former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher. Fortunately, Heinrich von Bruning was able to escape to America just in time. Okay, now that Hitler had purged the Nazi Party of any potential rivals and had established his political control over Germany, he wanted to take control of the culture. His control of the culture became known as Gleichschaltung. Sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. So he brought the Nazi ideology into schools in order to indoctrinate the children, and teachers who were not Nazis lost their jobs. He created the Hitler Youth, which was basically like Boy Scouts, but indoctrinating children in Nazism. By 1939, well into his reign, all children were forced to join. And then, as many of you know, Hitler wasn't a big fan of labor unions, but he did want some sort of nationalism. So he blended labor unions with nationalism by creating this labor union for all of Germany. And then he began his crackdown on Jews and communists. He banned them from jobs, and those who did not join the Nazi Party often lost their jobs. So this created an incentive to join the Nazi Party. And then Joseph Goebbels created the Reich Culture Chamber, which took over the press, radio, films, and they began to take over theaters and music lessons. They were trying to take over entertainment to brainwash people into Nazism. Now, as many of you all remember, Paul von Hindenburg was still the president of Germany, so he was still an obstacle to Hitler being a complete dictator. However, he died at the age of 86. I mean, the situation is pretty bad when the only obstacle for Hitler being a complete dictator is an 86-year-old president. And then Hitler decided that he would combine a president and chancellor into what became a Führer. So they held a referendum for that. And 89% supposedly voted to combine president and chancellor. But and 89, that figure is actually pretty suspicious. I mean, it's pretty weird how in 1932, 37% of the population supports Hitler, and 2 years later, 89% of the population supports him. You have something pretty interesting going on here. Well, it was not a very fair referendum. Stormtroopers were placed at polling stations, and all those people were forced to vote in public so that, oh, you guys are against Hitler? Are you really against Hitler? And people were discouraged to vote by themselves, and there were parts saying, oh, if you want to vote in secret, well, you're a traitor. So signs were reading, only traitors enter here were put up. And then Hitler was a complete dictator of Germany. And you guys know what happens after that, don't you?